Thanks very much for the opportunity to stand in front of you and share a testimony. It's not often that I get to do this. I don't have a mountaintop experience. My experience was much more, I don't know how you would, it's much more mundane. I was brought up in a church. I was brought up in a UCC church. And I attended, my parents were very faithful in attending St. James United Church of Christ in West Reading. And it was there that I learned Bible lessons in Sunday school. I sang in choir. I sang in the cherub choir. I sang in the junior choir. I sang in the intermediate choir, and I sang in senior choir. And I suspect that, as I look back now, that most of the theology that I learned as an unsaved churchgoer was in the hymns, in the music that we sang. But I did certainly develop a love of the music, of the hymns, of the faith. I love the harmonies. I love especially when the music fits the words, and things like the Hallelujah chorus. Some of the finest music ever written has been Christian music. In UCC church, what happens is you get baptized as an infant, and you go through a confirmation process as a teenager. At about age 12, you're asked to confirm your baptism. That is to say, that you now believe the creeds of the faith into which you were baptized. So I went through the process. It was painful, to say the least. I still remember very distinctly the pastor correcting my testimony, my answers. No, you don't mean that you believe this, you mean you believe this. Okay, if I'm going to get through confirmation, I guess I better say the right things. And what it did is kind of made it meaningless to me. And everything in the preaching of when I became of an age where I could understand the preaching, all of it was okay. Everything's okay. You've been baptized. You're a dues-paying member. We got platitudes from the pulpit, and it was, as I said, it was meaningless. It was meaningless. So when I was 18, I went to college and didn't look back. I didn't darken the door of a church except for Christmas and Easter. During all my college years, several years after college, I met, well, Beth and I had met in college, but we got married several years out of college. And quite frankly, although I was a good person, I lived like a pagan. I was happy when Beth was taking the kids to church. Beth attended a Methodist church, and when we had our two children, Annie and Henry, she was very faithful at taking them to church, and I was very happy for that. But I stayed home and watched CBS News, professional wrestling, things that you would expect a pagan to do. And we just lived life. We just kept going. It's just the way people roll through. And in my late 30s, I started to get some, my mid-30s, I was very political. I was very angry about politics around us. I became what most people would call a tax protester. I worked at trying to rescind my Social Security number, kicking against the goads, as we just read. But all ineffective. It was all ineffective, and it had no meaning to me. I thought it would, but it didn't. And it all seemed so futile. And it was the futility in that time of futility and understanding that it was also meaningless, that I happened to be working in Malvern part-time, but I would have a lengthy drive in the mornings. And after a while, political radio, if you've ever listened to talk radio, this is pre-Rush Limbaugh, but it was still pretty, eventually it gets boring. It's the same thing over and over and over. And one morning I was driving and saying, well, this is just crazy. And so I started looking around on the dial. What can I find, something else to listen to? And I found a hymn. It was WBYN, and they were playing religious Christian music, and they were familiar old hymns. And so I started finding myself timing my drives to make sure that I got to the hymns, and after the hymns, preachers, radio preachers would come on. And I started finding myself timing my drives more for the preachers than for the hymns, because they were actually preaching responsibility and the gospel. And I can remember saying to Beth one time, you gotta listen to WBYN, there's this guy on there, Chuck somebody, keeps preaching the gospel. And it was Chuck Swindoll, who is a radio preacher many of you may have heard over the years. Now, Chuck Swindoll is a dispensational preacher. But he doesn't leave you any wiggle room as far as your own personal commitment and your own personal responsibility to believe on Jesus Christ and the work that Christ did on the cross. So I began reading my Bible. Again, I mean, I had a passing familiarity with the Bible. And about this time, the Lord was working in Beth's life, and she announced to me, you know, I think I've become a Christian. And I said, oh, Beth, you don't want to do that. She really, it's so radical. It's so radical. So, too late. It's too late. But I wasn't there yet. I just wasn't there. We continued, but we started listening to the radio together. We started sharing books back and forth, reading the same things in the Bible. And we started listening to another radio preacher, David Jeremiah, who's a radically dispensational preacher. But the Lord just kept nagging me and nagging me. I had to listen to it. I had to read it. And it was on a vacation in the Adirondacks, and I don't remember the date. We were with my sister and brother-in-law, whom we used to vacation with. And I remember waking up one morning thinking, I am a Christian. I do believe this. And we began to attend a church, a real church that preached the gospel. And, we attended Grace Bible Fellowship Church in Reading, Pennsylvania. And we got some good teaching there. We really learned a lot there. But I'm a curious guy by nature, and some of the dispensational teaching that we had received didn't sit very well. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and I kept asking questions, uncomfortable questions, I think, for some people at the church where we were attending. And especially noticed the compartmentalization of life. That the Christianity that I have now, I felt like I'm really missing something. It's like, okay, we're saved. We both got saved about the same time, and God was so gracious in doing that. But still, there was something missing in it. There was what now about it. what do we do about it? And there's certainly plenty of programs to plug into. Beth was plugged into Awana and several different ministries there. I was going to Bible studies, but I kept, again, there was that nagging. There's something missing here. And interestingly, Joel and Audrey walked into our lives at Grace Bible Fellowship. And Joel started pointing out that Christianity is for all of life. For all of life. And it seemed a little bit unusual because it's not something that you get from radio preachers, and it's not something that we were getting at church. But we soon found ourselves, when we had questions, going to Joel for our answers, found that Joel was our pastor long before he left Grace Bible Fellowship Church. And so I kept reading, kept studying, finally abandoned I had already abandoned the dispensational portion of my theology for the amillennial viewpoint. But as I studied and read and continued in the Word, reading good commentators, taking questions back and forth to Joel and other teachers that we've met over the years, finally realized that the comprehensive view that was necessary pushed me into a postmillennial viewpoint and pushed me into a theonomic viewpoint, which is to say that my Christianity needs to inform my every action at work, when I'm driving, and I'm still working on that part. The road is still littered with my murders as I drive back and forth to work. Raka, you fool. But it needs to inform all of my life, and it needs to direct my steps. And so that's my story. It's not dramatic. I didn't have a light from Damascus, or light on the road to Damascus. I didn't have a mountaintop experience as Peter, James, and John did on the Mount of Transfiguration. None of those visions, nothing like that. Just a slow and steady nagging by our Lord, who is sometimes described as the hound of heaven. He pursued me, and he certainly won my heart and my mind. And that's where I am now. I try to be fully engaged with the world around me for Christ and for Christ's purposes. My wife once accused me, and this is back in her pagan years. She said, "Bing, life just goes on around you, doesn't it?" And I think it did. I think that's part of the profound selfishness that I carried with me. That, most of life just didn't matter, it didn't affect me. It just went on around me. But now I try to engage. I'm trying to engage. We've started this work here at Independence Reformed Bible Church as a labor of love, and in expectation that God is going to work a work. Joel said, "I'm looking forward to your testimony this morning," and I shut back at him. Every Sunday we come in here, and I look here, and you guys are the testimony. Each and every one of you is testimony. It's just amazing to me that God will work a work as He has, and as He continues to do here at IRBC. So that's my story. And I want to thank each and every one of you. You have no understanding of the depth of gratitude that I have for your all being here every week. It's a wonderful thing. It's a lovely thing to see how God works and to be among God's people. I want to thank you.